Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Primordia for PC. This is a point-and-click adventure game developed by Wormwood Studios and published by Watch Games in December of last year. And this is notable for a few reasons. First off, if you see my reviews of the Blackwell series as well as Resonance, you know I rather enjoy Watch work. They've been pretty much leading the whole old-school adventure game renaissance, so to speak. And so I was looking forward to Primordia based on that alone. But it was also because it was an interesting concept to begin with. And I wanted to see how they really explored it, because it wasn't really something you see in adventure games for the most part. So the question becomes, how did they pull it off? Well, as far as the presentation goes, you have to keep a couple things in mind. The first of these being that it is an old-school styled adventure game, which means that it's going to have pixel art, it's going to be 2D. And in this case, it works out really well in the game's favor because they managed to put quite a bit of detail into that pixel art. And things you wouldn't necessarily expect to be as detailed as they are in this game actually are quite detailed. It lends quite a bit of authenticity to the game. And it's to the point where even if you can't necessarily tell off the top of your head, you can actually look at something and be like, okay, I get kind of what that is. I may not know how to use it, but I get what it is, even though this is a futuristic styled setting. And then, of course, I'm going to talk about the color scheme, and everybody's going to probably be like, but what? But the brown and gray styling in this thing, where there's barely any color in this game at all, works really well in its favor. Because it's a post-apocalyptic setting, and they managed to actually pull it off believably rather than other games that I won't mention, where it just comes across as awful looking. It really does help that the art in this game is reflected in the fact that everything is a machine. And so everything looks basically like a machine. It looks either metallic, or maybe it's rusted, or something like that. And so it actually fits in with the game quite well, and they did quite a good job with it. As far as the animations go, they are suitably robotic, as in they look kind of clunky, and you can tell it's intentional. There's not a huge amount of movement in the animations themselves, and it works out pretty well, because you don't really expect a robot to move very smoothly or fluidly like, say, a person would. So, again, it works out pretty well in the game's favor. But what about the sound design? And this is kind of where things diverge from the art. On the one hand, you have sound effects, which you can barely hear. At least I could barely hear them whenever I played this thing, because I would just go into a situation and sound effects would happen, and I'd just sit there going, okay, maybe I should turn up my volume. Oh wait, it's at max. Okay, well then, that's kind of a problem. So they're a bit too quiet, but if you really do listen to them, they sound just effective. And that's exactly what they're supposed to be. They're just supposed to be there and be appropriate and work quite well for what they do. They're not supposed to wow you, they're just supposed to get the job done. And, of course, they get the job done. The music is this pretty interesting styling to it. It's pretty much electronic music, and it works pretty well in the game's favor. It gives you quite a big sense of mystery, and so that fits in together really well with the game's theme. But what steals the show here is the voice acting. The cast did a phenomenal job, and it really helps that you have very good talent, like the two main characters in this game being voiced, if you're playing, you talk about Horatio, the main character that you're actually playing as, being voiced by Logan Cunningham, who, if you don't know that by now, he was the narrator in Bastion, aka the character Rux, and he is also in other things as well. He's in the upcoming Transistor as well, and he's worked with Watch before. But it's pretty interesting because he gives this character who, if you look at the personality of this robot, it's kind of robotic. And he manages to pull it off quite well. Even though he does manage to grow this character over time just by slightly altering the way he reads the lines. It's pretty interesting. It would take quite a bit of talent to pull this role off, I believe, and he managed to do it quite well. And his sidekick, Crispin, is voiced by Abe Goldfarb, who, if you don't know that, has been in Watch the games before as well. And he does a phenomenal job as the kind of goofy sidekick with a lot of personality, a lot of heart, and you can really get attached to these characters just by their voices alone. And that extends to the rest of the cast, actually. While certain robots sound very robotic and personalityless, they're supposed to. And others actually do seem to have a great deal of personality about them, and it works out really well in the game's favor. The voice acting really does tie everything together, particularly because, like a lot of adventure games, this is a very dialogue-heavy game. And so, having this really top-notch voice cast really does propel the game forward quite a bit. But what really matter are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you play as Horatio No-Built version 5. You're a robot who lives out in the dunes, and he built this companion robot called Crispin, Horatio built, of course. And this is basically just a floating head, and he floats around and cracks jokes and is constantly making light of situations and everything. Whereas Horatio's very serious, he's to the point, he doesn't really engage in humor at all. And the interaction between those two characters is actually very interesting, because it comes across as really genuine rather than something that's kind of contrived. And that's kind of surprising, because it makes you able to get attached to these characters rather than just playing as them and being like, okay, whatever. So they actually have a lot of charm in that, the two characters and their relationship with one another. It's actually quite interesting to play through. But the main story of this game is that this robot comes out of nowhere when they're trying to work on this ship called the Unique, and actually zaps Horatio with a laser, then takes their power core and runs off. Now, they need this power core not only to be able to recharge their systems, but to power the Unique itself. And so after they get their emergency generator up and running and manage to get themselves recharged, they go on this quest to basically find this robot and take back their power core. But this leads them to a lot of questions throughout the entire game. The first ones that you're starting with are, of course, who is this robot? Where did he take the power core? Why did he take the power core? Another question that arises fairly early on is, what happened to the humans? Now, this is one where it's kind of interesting, because you can go through this whole game and you pretty much know what happened to the humans. But even knowing what happened, just from being able to infer it all, it's still interesting to find out what actually happened, and the whole backstory to this thing. And the way they've actually set this game up is it really does come across as this kind of mystery, where you're uncovering more of the story as you go, and you're uncovering clues that really let you know what happened, and how everything played out, and what your identity in this world is. And so the game ends up raising a lot of questions throughout it. I don't want to spoil it all for you, but suffice to say, I actually found the story very engaging and very interesting, particularly when you got toward the end and it really started to explain everything, and everything really came together, and it's like, I get it now. I understand. There's a lot of stuff that gets hinted at pretty early on, but you don't really understand it until late in the game. So it's actually very interesting in that regard, and the whole story itself actually ends up being very interesting. It also helps that the game has 8 endings, so there is actually quite a bit of replayability despite being a point-and-click adventure game. Which leads me to the gameplay, because 8 endings will actually, of course, fall into the gameplay as well. But how well are the puzzles designed and everything? Because that's pretty much all you're going to be doing throughout this game. You're going to be solving puzzles, talking to other robots, and that sort of thing. You're going to have an inventory system. You might have to use Crispin to get to locations where you can't. And so the puzzles themselves, while most of them aren't that difficult, some of them do actually have multiple solutions. And so that gives you some replayability as well. And depending on how you solve those puzzles, things might play out differently. And so, again, there's actual replayability here. And the puzzles themselves, again, while they're not particularly difficult, they are challenging enough. They don't just seem like obstacles in your way. They actually seem pretty intuitive to the actual game, because you're trying to figure out how to resolve things and how to unscramble codes and such like that, and of course figure out what people actually want from you. And so the gameplay itself, while pretty typical of point-and-click adventure games, does have some variety to it, and it is a very solid experience as far as that point-and-click adventure gameplay goes. It's fairly simplified, and that's in keeping with the rest of the games that Wajidai has produced, but that's kind of the good thing about it. Not only is it an easy game to get into and play, but you can really focus on that story and that interesting world. And that's really the big strength of this game, is its writing. And so you have this game where the gameplay is certainly solid enough, and the puzzles, while again they aren't that difficult, they are challenging enough. And at least you can't get really frustrated with it like you can with other adventure games. And so, playing through this game, you'll find that that story unfolds around you and gets more and more interesting until you finally get to the end, and then you have 8 endings available to you, depending on what you do. And some of it's not always obvious. So, ultimately, Primordia is a very well done adventure game. It has an interesting story with an interesting backstory and world surrounding it. It's got good characters, good writing, good dialogue. It keeps you interested throughout the entirety of the game. The puzzles aren't too challenging, but they're just challenging enough. And that level of replayability is not what you're used to in a point-and-click adventure game. And so that does lend quite a bit to this game. And so ultimately, I give it a 4 out of 5. Thanks for watching.